Good morning, my name is Victoria Petracca, and I'm excited to present the Community Preservation Act to all of you watching today, either with us here at their Memorial Library or at home. The Community Preservation Act is also known as CPA, and you may be hearing more about this in the coming months, and we wanted a chance to tell you what it is, how it works, and speak to the benefits of it for Lancaster and residents. So CPA allows all of the towns and municipalities in the Commonwealth to establish a fund that is specifically dedicated to 4 areas: historic preservation, open space, recreation, and affordable housing. It's important to note that these 4 areas, which are very important locally, are often the areas that are restricted or underfunded in town budgets, particularly when a town faces a financial difficulty. These are often things that are eliminated first. By having CPA in place, this gives us a safeguard to ensure that towns can still move forward with initiatives in these 4 areas. Where does the money come from, particularly if we're concerned about a town that is facing a financial difficulty? Funds are collected as a 1 to 3% annual surcharge to local property taxes. What we are proposing as a group of residents is that we enter CPA at the lowest percentage, at 1%. This works out to be less than $50 per average Lancaster residential assessment. And I will walk you through that math in the next slide. We're also proposing an exemption for the first $100,000 of assessed property value. That's a very popular exemption with CPA that's typically included for most towns that have enacted this. We're also proposing another exemption, an exemption for qualified ownership of Lancaster's low-income housing, that's for everyone, and low and moderate income senior housing. A taxpayer receiving a regular property tax abatement or exemption will also receive a prorate reduction in surcharge. So if you have another abatement in place, that holds, and there's a prorated application of that to CPA. So let's do the math on this with a concrete example. So we're using the 2019 tax rate and the average residential assessment from that year. So the average residential assessment for a single-family home is $339,500. I'm over in the first box on the left of the screen, letter A. So if I take that single-family home and I apply the tax rate per $1,000, that's $19.75, and I apply that, I'm just multiplying A times B, the property tax bill sent to that household would be $6,705.13. So that's prior to CPA. Now, if the town voters pass CPA, what happens to that same tax bill? Well, applying the first exemption that we mentioned in the last slide, we remove the first $100,000 of property value. So we now have, we come to letter E, we now have a taxable value under CPA of $239,500. So then, taking the tax rate in B and multiplying that times the basis in E, we have a tax bill of $4,730.13. Then applying the surcharge of 1%, so F times G, we add in $47.30. That then gives us a property tax with CPA of $6,752.43. So the question becomes, if we as Lancaster voters are willing to invest less than $1 per week for a better future for our town. So let's think about how much would be collected. At a minimum, we're talking about $133,000 plus a state contribution. And that's a really important part of why we should pass CPA. So not only are we raising funds locally, but then because we've passed CPA, our town is now eligible to receive state funding. So where does the state funding come from? It comes from transaction fees at the Registry of Deeds, which amounted to $23.2 million in fiscal year 2019, as well as from a state budget surplus of another $20 million. So these state contributions are distributed to the towns in Massachusetts that have passed CPA. And they're distributed based on each town's contribution level. If anyone wants to get into that level of detail, we can talk about that, but there are precise formulas that are used for that. The larger point is that towns across the Commonwealth that have looked into CPA and enacted it are reaping the benefits of that money. The group of residents in Lancaster that have looked into this would like Lancaster to receive that money as well. This is important to note. We as a town are already paying into that state fund. Every town in Massachusetts is paying into that. Every resident is paying into that. But we get nothing back today. So we contribute without reaping the benefits. This money is being dispersed to other towns right around us that have passed CPA. What are we missing out on? We're missing out on something that these towns have figured out that are right in our general vicinity. Ayer, Boxborough, Groton, Harvard, Hudson, Littleton, Stowe, and West Boylston have all passed the Community Preservation Act, and they are all receiving their state distribution on top of what they're raising locally. So let's take one example here. I'm going to choose the town of Harvard. So Harvard received as a state distribution in 2019, $32,617. They have received since fiscal year 05 over $1.2 million in CPA funds. And think about all of the wonderful projects that Lancaster could do with that money that Harvard has received. So 176 communities, that's 50% across Massachusetts, have passed this, and the number grows each and every year as communities look into this, explain it to their fellow residents, and pass it. Yes, it is a new tax, but it's a little different. Adoption of CPA would mean a small property tax increase for Lancaster property owners. But here are the differences between CPA and standard taxes. The funds raised receive an additional annual state contribution that we just discussed. The community decides how these funds will be spent. It's decided at the local level, and we'll talk about that in a minute, how that decision-making takes place. This money, CPA money, can be used as matching funds that are required by many state and federal grants. So if we're looking for multiple sources to fund a terrific project in our town, and some of that is is through a grant program. Very often, grant programs at the state and federal level require towns to have some skin in the game. How do we put that skin in the game? One way is with CPA funds, making us more successful with our grant proposals. Funds are dedicated to projects that are typically underfunded or unfunded altogether. We talked about that at the beginning, those 4 areas. CPA facilitates knowledge of and participation in proposed community projects. So because we're able to have this funding, we're now talking about projects that we would like to do as a community. How do we go about adopting this? We need a town meeting vote to place CPA on the November 3rd ballot. When does that happen? On Monday, May 4th, 2020. That is our spring town meeting. If that article passes, we need to form a CPA ballot question committee to have this on the November ballot. That's the presidential ballot. And this would be on there along with our presidential choices. That will require Secretary of State approval. If the article does not pass at town meeting, we can enact a citizen's petition and then follow the same step for the CPA ballot question committee. The ballot vote at the presidential election will take place on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020. If CPA passes on November 3rd, we then form a community preservation committee, and that needs to be voted on at the following town meeting. And then we draft a community preservation plan. How are the funds managed and dispersed? This is why we need to form a CPA committee if we pass it in November. That CPA committee facilitates proposals for all projects. There is a minimum 10% of collected funds to be allocated to each of 3 primary categories. Historic preservation, open space and recreation are put together under the statute, and finally, affordable housing. This allows flexibility so that the community can determine the allocation for the remaining 70%. Now, the remaining 70% must be used in those same areas. We can't use the 70% to, say, fund a new school or to buy a piece of equipment for the Department of Public Works. The 70% must be used in those areas. If we have a significant project in one of those 3 areas that would require more than 10% funding, that's where advocates for that project could go to the committee and request increased funding that would come from that remaining 70%. The Community Preservation Committee takes in and approves the project proposals, but all of those projects then go to town meeting for final approval of the funding. The wonderful thing about this process is that Lancaster residents ultimately control the funding for CPA. So we're deciding locally what happens with this money. What kinds of projects can be funded with this? And this is the great part about the presentation, is we get into very Lancaster specific ideas and projects that people would like to see happen in our town. I'm going to show you some examples of projects that could have qualified and then some new projects. So if we had enacted CPA prior, the Thayer Memorial Park Playground and Splash Pad renovation work to date could have benefited from CPA. The accessible canoe launch that went in could have benefited from CPA. The Cook Conservation Area bridge and lot renovations, eligible for CPA. Future projects that could qualify. The Thayer Memorial Park still has lots more renovation ahead, including the tennis courts and the basketball courts. There are important baseball and softball field renovations that have been proposed, awaiting funding. There is much trail development and preservation that would be wonderful for Lancaster. Again, where does that funding come from? It could come from CPA if we pass it. The Lancaster Town Beach could benefit from CPA funds. We could do land acquisition through Chapter 61A and have the ability to exercise the town's right of first refusal. Many of you have heard about a piece of land on Deershorn Road in Chapter 61A. The town has a right of first refusal on that piece of land. It is currently under agreement with a private developer. The town could exercise its right of first refusal, but the town would need funding to purchase that and preserve it as open space, or perhaps keep it in an agricultural use with a farmer. Again, CPA would help with that. Another project area is historic preservation. A few completed projects that could have qualified: the community center renovation and the Prescott building renovation. Both wonderful projects that we have all benefited from as residents, board members, town employees. So many people have reaped the benefits of those projects. Those could have been done with CPA funding. I'm not saying they could have been done entirely with CPA funding, but CPA funding could have helped offset the cost. Future projects that could qualify: our town hall, its renovation and reuse, and this historic cemetery preservation. The decamp properties on Old Common Road that are vacant, perhaps their acquisition, their renovation, their reuse. CPA, again, could be a slice of that funding pie. And finally, affordable housing, the last area that could benefit from CPA. This is so very important to our town. Affordable housing. How do we as a community get up and over the 10% state mandated requirement? One way is to pass CPA. Many towns around us and in other parts of Massachusetts have enacted CPA and used that funding to help their community get up and over that 10% that is required of every municipality in the Commonwealth. It's important to the town to keep existing affordable units to prevent losing them off of our roster to market rate units. In other words, when an affordable unit comes up for sale, after a certain time period, if no one has come forward and been matched with that unit and it has not been sold to an income eligible household, then that unit can be sold at market rate, and it is no longer a deed restricted affordable unit. We currently see this happen all the time. Units come up for sale, nobody is matched, and the unit comes to the Board of Selectmen. We don't have the funding to buy it and hold it, and that unit ultimately goes to sale to a market rate sale, and we lose that off of our inventory. By enacting CPA, we could stabilize those existing affordable units. We could also rehabilitate existing vacant housing, and these are examples from DCAM. So you can use CPA in two ways at once, through historic preservation as well as affordable housing in this instance. The other picture is from an existing 40B development in town, an affordable unit. So the example of keeping existing units. We can also use CPA funds to convert vacant space into senior housing, for instance. This is the Memorial School. We can develop new units with good design and positive environmental stewardship. In other words, we can get into the driver's seat of affordable housing instead of having projects that are basically dropped into our community through Chapter 40B. We as a community can come up with projects that we endorse and support and propose and work with developers to see through and use CPA funding to help fund that. What community preservation projects would you like to add? We've only shown you things that residents have talked about to date, but there are other ideas out there in the community, and CPA is about generating ideas and bringing more ideas to the table and seeing what we as a community would like to see happen locally. So, how can you and I help pass CPA? Well, in February and March 2020, this is a time period where we can ask questions, we can read about it, and we can comment, we can become familiar with it, try it on. And if this makes sense to you, we ask that you endorse it, that you talk to other people about it, that you spread the word about it. In April through October, we would like to publicize this, and we need help with that. We'd like to publicize this in advance of the town meeting vote on May 4th, which again is about getting this on the ballot, and then publicizing the vote that will take place on November 3rd at the presidential election. So to be clear, May 4th is not the vote on whether or not to have CPA in Lancaster. It's the vote to get this onto the ballot in November. And then in November, we will hopefully have the larger vote whether or not to pass CPA in Lancaster. And then beyond November, if this passes, please consider volunteering for the future CPA committee to evaluate project proposals. There's more information available at www.communitypreservation.org. That is the state-level coalition for CPA. They have an incredible amount of information available there where you can get into the more granular level of detail about how each and every aspect of CPA works. And then there is also a residents group in Lancaster who has dug in quite a bit and would be happy to answer questions as well. So we are asking you to seriously consider this, all of its benefits to the town, to please come on May 4th to town meeting and help get this onto the ballot in November by voting yes. Thank you so much for your attention today. Again, my name is Victoria Petracca. I would be delighted to speak with anyone offline about CPA, and we thank you so much for tuning into this and learning about CPA and all of the wonderful things that a town can accomplish by passing it. Thank you.